Actually, can I blow my nose?
Yeah.
Good idea.
Tissues. Oh, I'd actually wait. Alright. Thank you.
Oh, stop being so nice to each other. Just go through. Oh,
The worst when they ask for like stationery. I haven't asked for stationery.
didn't you ask?
Study is very big offenders.
When you edged out.
Like, I bought all the paper.
It's fine if judges do that.
Well, I actually bought my own paper, and they went, oh, we haven't brought it.
When opposing teams ask.
Am I audible? 3, 2, 1. I have family in China. I know members of the CCP. What they worry about is incessant and unending lockdowns in Shanghai, for example. What they don't care about is where their vaccines are made. What they care about is their lives. Quickly, at the actor and setup, 2 things. Who are the CCP and what are their priorities? Firstly, we say the CCP is actually like the combination of, say, 95 million members, which is to say most of them are composed of educated, middle class, upper middle class, elite, bureaucratic, business leaders, business people. We would say, as an example, as a debating society, Macquarie is not just Udai, it is the all of us, it is everyone here. That is also to say, analogous to that, Xi Jinping, yes, he is a dictator, but he does not hold absolute power over all 95 million members of the CCP. There are still internal structural government structures. People still have a degree of say. What are the CCP's priorities? Firstly, power, status, and maintaining, governance of the people of China. Secondly, with all things being equal, having strong economic, growth, things of that degree, less dead people, probably a good thing for everyone. Thirdly, we would say they also quite value international prestige, respect, and the influence and the respect of countries around the world. However, I want to note, all 3 of those priorities, they're not all equally weighted. So for example, as Xi Jinping and as the people of CCP in China, they probably care more about less dead people, care more about the economic strength and stability of China than what the West, says about them or perceives about them. Okay, now the rest of my speech is going to address why China needs to vaccinate again, and why they need to do it quickly, and why the vaccines need to actually work. 3 ideas. Firstly, about this history of COVID in China. Firstly, we began with aggressive lockdowns. This was very early on. They were quite effective. And this removed the focus away from China's vaccines because this, really stopped the first wave of COVID, the first instance of COVID from really ripping through provinces. We would say there was, as a result, minimal COVID implications. It was seemingly well managed. China felt like they had the solution. They had the, out of the pandemic. Okay. We would say that, secondly, after that initial lockdown period, 2 things have gone wrong. Firstly, mutated strains such as Omicron. They have been much faster. Things such as, the main process of the Chinese government or Chinese CCP of lockdown has been ineffective in changing and heeding the spread of, say, Omicron because of the infectivity of Omicron, because of the R0 value of Omicron, because of strains like that. Lockdown does somewhat impede it, but things like vaccines are much more effective and they cannot be contained through the current means. Secondly, we would say China's vaccines, for reasons that I detailed earlier about how lockdowns were quite effective in the first instance, this removed the onus to very quickly have efficacious and very good rollout of vaccines. But secondly, just in general, empirically, Sinovac, shit like that, they kind of suck, just statistically, especially in comparison to the Western mRNA vaccines that have come out from the West, right? We would say that, the reason for this is a couple things. So firstly, China, while they are quite economically dominant, they are still developing in a lot of areas of their country. That is to say, not only in certain provinces and in certain areas, but also in things like biotech, which is to say, there are multiple reasons why things like Sinovac, Sinopharm haven't worked. Which is to say, firstly, there wasn't an open push by the CCP at an advertising level to get vaccinations out because of the usefulness and the efficiency of lockdowns in the first instance, but also because, for example, if we look at Australia, in the first half of 2021, we thought that COVID was over. That was before the second wave hit us. We think that perception is very similar to what China thought, which is to say, they thought they had successfully dealt with the worst of COVID. They thought that the lockdowns were enough. They didn't realize COVID would absolutely rip through their provinces. They didn't realize that they needed vaccines. Vaccines were a secondary, priority. Okay, so moving on, the problem with this. So why and who has the CCP failed and why they need vaccines? So they failed actually for a lot of reasons. They failed the elderly, they failed the medically vulnerable, they failed everybody who has passed who could have maybe done better if they had better vaccines. And we would say, vaccines empirically do save lives, especially for COVID. And we would say that, that's a solution that Affirmative is proposing. Okay, what are the policy consequences of our model or our burden? So firstly, we would say, let's assume that we go under negative and we don't embrace Western mRNA. What happens? Well, there are two options. You just give up, which is what a lot of countries do. You just cop the COVID, you stop the lockdowns, you just take the front of COVID, like a lot of developing nations. Even like Australia, right now we've just copped the cases. What happens? You rip through China because of the nature of how big China is in terms of population. Millions of people are dead. Family members of the CCP, family and just people of China are dead. It's probably a bad thing, right? We want to stop that. Or the other alternative is to continue lockdowns and try to deal with COVID using the vaccines they already have. Why does this not work? Look at Shanghai, the house raids of the police, pulling and dragging family members out of their rooms, preventing children from meeting with their family members because a kid has, COVID and they can't see their parents. We think this clearly isn't working in the status quo. We need to do something, right? First of all, we would know that the chaos of COVID in China is I can't utter it. It is so unpopular to the extent the Chinese people are literally protesting. They're protesting in the face of the CCP. That should say something in and of itself. Weibo is a primary social platform. They literally had so much social discourse that they literally overcame the censors, the Great Firewall of China, so famous for being able to censor things like Winnie the Pooh. They literally overcame that with how fucked or how mad they were at COVID and the CCP dealing with COVID in the status quo. Which is all to say there is a significantly large population in China. All of them aren't happy with the status quo. They want solutions. And there are a lot of people who aren't particularly wealthy who need money. For example, another thing you can look at is look at the food rations in China. Look at the homelessness. Look at the people raiding banks and protesting and sleeping outside their buildings. We think this is all to show the descent and the degree of unease that exists in China. Okay. Along with that, let's look at it economically. We would say that, China probably, if you have dead people and people who can't eat, your economy goes kaput. We would say that the reason that this is important is because economically China is still quite important to the West. This is one of the main incentives for the West to actually help them. We would also say that the West has multiple other incentives to help China or give them the vaccines. Okay, let's say, let's move on to the last part of my speech. So we would say that, first of all, the West largely needs China's manufacturing and exports. We would say they will most likely sell us the vaccines because they have minimal incentives not to. We would say the supply chain disruption, the upward pressure of selling these vaccines is, for example, a key incentive for Biden because he's literally terrified of inflation, so he needs it to get elected again. We would say this is an example for him to make sure economy doesn't just explode internationally. They want China to be doing well enough. We would say, what are the incentives for everybody to get vaccinated? We as a CCP, we historically do not care about lying to our people. We just give them vaccines, we force them, we fine them, we kick them out of their jobs if they're not vaccinated, first reason. Secondly, people realize COVID is dog shit, right? If vaccine solves that problem, me as a Chinese person probably will go get the vaccine, even if there is a lot of vaccine hesitancy, even if there is a lot of false advertising, even if there is a historical distrust of the West. Even as someone who maybe lived in China for 18 years, for example, probably still get the vaccine. That's why we win. Thank you. I'd like to thank the first film this speech for that speech, apart from the first negative speech.
Fix that.
That is iconic behaviour. Just film me. Just your reactions.
I think the commentary would be. New Zealanders tried that once, remember? New Zealanders tried that once, Joe BP, Joe Gary, all that, Joe Ashcroft.
That's actually quite interesting.
Mason's World Debate Super League. You can do it there. Mason. Did you read the Mason's proposal? Oh, no, I didn't really. It seems like it's a bad idea. It's a bad idea. Yeah. I think it's great. How are you going to manage betting laws internationally? Oh, no. That's so good. Sportsbet did this thing so like they did bets for Worlds. They did bets for Worlds one time, I think 2018. Woo!
The zero COVID policy of China is a road they've been walking down for 2 years. When AF tells you that the choice is like take Western vaccines or give up, this is not the choice. The choice is like redoubled vaccines using these redoubled vaccine efforts using these Western mRNAs, which could cost millions of lives, or focusing on the Chinese vaccine. If we want more vaccinations, there's no reason China can't just increase their own production, speaker. So, set up why we think the COVID zero policy is not within their interest. Why China's own vaccine development is the best, why this is going to harm the international relationships, and why China will be fine in the status quo. If it's not broke, don't fix it. So, 5 claims in setup. Firstly, the interest of the actor. Isaac tells you that the CCP has lots of different members, lots of people involved. We're going to tell you very clearly that Xi Jinping is the key actor in the CCP. This is seen in the fact that he has lots of power. This is seen in the fact that he's risen to power. He has lots of support. His interests are directly tied to the CCP. They are not detachable in this debate, unlike Isaac tells you, because as he rises to power, he builds friends. As he continues his power, he builds friends as well. People become loyal to him. But also we see this in his plans, right? Xi Jinping knows that he's the controlling interest in the CCP because he has plans to do things, because he has plans to increase his leadership term. He's been in power for 2 terms. He has the most say over what happens in the CCP. They are not detachable. Secondly, right, in setup, everything has to follow a script until autumn this year, speaker, where Xi Jinping is going to use a 5-year party congress to run for a 3rd term in defiance of Chinese norms, in defiance of CCP norms, where you only run for 2 terms. That means that everything has to run well, everything has to run to script. China has to be stable and successful for that point in time, because he needs that to run well so that he can get elected there, right? Third, the CCP has ideological interest, right? That ideological interest is mainly a lack of dependence on other nations. They want to be seen as independent. They want to be seen as providing everything for their citizens. They do not want to be seen as having to rely on the West. Fourthly, the CCP has an interest in appearing powerful. We see this in the use of censorship, right? Where if they actually cared about being powerful in a genuine, constructive way that is best for their people, they wouldn't waste so much of their political capital on censorship. That means, right, they are very happy to engage in harmful ways of ensuring power if it means they can keep that power. Fifthly, they are happy to prioritise the utility of the many over the liberties of the few, right? They're a deeply utilitarian government. We see this in things like harsh lockdowns, coercive mass testing, and the cost the CCP has been happy to pay for many people to avoid getting COVID at the loss of individual liberties, right? So, on to our first point of substantive. Why a change in the COVID zero policy is not within the interest for the CCP, right? Firstly, exiting the COVID zero policy is far less stable. It has significant risks because the Chinese government has not prepared the Chinese citizens for living with COVID zero. It has large changes. It's an entirely new environment for that population. It is an entirely new light for Xi Jinping to shine himself in, right? He's gotten very good at showing that he is strong and powerful in a COVID zero policy. If they abandon that policy, in the status quo, if they abandon that policy, he has to completely readapt the way that he markets himself. Number 2, using the vaccine to reduce COVID isn't magic, right? Even if they use the Western mRNA, because of things like low infection, and that means low immunity rates within the community, it is still likely millions of people die in China. That is particularly difficult. When Isaac tells you that the CCP doesn't want to see people die, we co-opt that outside the house because we tell you that relying on those Western vaccines to reduce your COVID-0 policy means that millions of people will die outside of the house. Will die on their side of the house, right? Even if these like nations with vaccines, and we see this because even nations with vaccines have had extensive mortality and infection rates. Look at Britain, where they had high vaccine rates, but still millions of people died, millions of people end up in hospital, those sorts of things, right? The impact of this, right, is that Xi Jinping has spent 2 years on brainwashing all of China on like their low infections and how all infections are like failures, right? And this is like all this does is sharpen the pain of those last 2 years of lockdowns as being futile. Thirdly, in this point, there's long-term interest, right? A slow increase in vaccine rates using the CCP vaccine is much better than, it's faster than breaking away from like an ingrained COVID-0 strategy, which worsens concessions and has no benefits to speed, right? If we do it really quickly, there's no particular benefits. So, second substantive. Why China's own vaccine development is probably best, right? Number one, it's highly likely they can develop this vaccine. That is because they have massive medical resources, a large medical technology industry, right? And mRNA vaccine technology has massively sped up the process of vaccine development. Number two, this new vaccine is likely to be far more effective than the existing ones. That is because the Western vaccines prevent death, but don't prevent infections, as a niche China is able to fill. That's a really big benefit. But thirdly, right? They have a revealed preference to rely on nationalist ideology, right? They've only used one vaccine so far. It's the same, and then they do this. It's the same for all other industries, right? In the extent that China is a very nationalistic society, and they would much rather rely on their strategies and their industries and their vaccines, even at the harm of efficiency, right? Because this this nationalism is the fire that keeps the CCP burning. This nationalism is built on anti-West sentiment. To accept Western vaccines is to destroy that nationalism, is to give up that, right? Every jab of a Western vaccine is a dose of hypocrisy in the arms of the Chinese people. That makes the riots that they tell you about a whole lot worse, because those 2 years of lockdowns have been ended with a huge hit of hypocrisy. That is really, really bad. And it says that China can't help you. You need to look to the West, actively against the interests of the CCP in maintaining their power, in maintaining their control. Then we see the international relation harms. China has engaged quite widely in vaccine diplomacy, where they give developing nations, they give small Pacific islands large amounts of their vaccine, right? They give them these things so they're able to vaccinate their populations, so that those Pacific islands develop affinity to China. That is really important to them. Any admission that the Western vaccine is needed massively reduces the demand for the China vaccine, right? A, that reduces their ability to engage in this vaccine diplomacy, but B, it also makes China weak on a world stage, right? Especially because when China does renege and go, oh, all right, we'll use the Western vaccine, all of the news articles in the West will be ripped with mirth. They'll have headlines like, China finally concedes that the Western vaccine is necessary. China finally reneges on its policy to only use their vaccine. That is particularly harmful, right? Because all these media in other nations are largely controlled by Western norms. It's a hugely symbolic concession in the Chinese medical and technology industry and their inability to respond. And that has massive effects on their market share, right? Because China still has a medical industry they want to function. If you cop this harm of having to tell everyone, oh, I guess we weren't quite up to it, your whole medical industry is harmed, it destabilizes your economy, all those sorts of things, right? That's particularly harmful. Finally, this speech speaker, why the CCP will be fine in the status quo. Because at the moment, at least for the next few years, number one, there's lots of facts that the CCP and Xi Jinping can rely on to justify their process, right? This looks like things like the fact that China has the lowest mortality rate among many large nations. It looks like the fact that their economy has grown the most in the G20 during the pandemic. These are facts that they can rely on, they can point to, they can call out, even if people are unhappy with the lockdowns. They can say, look, they might have been rough, but we have benefited you. Look at us, we're great, we provide. Secondly, the CCP has shown to struggle to calibrate policy or admit when it was wrong, even if the government is less effective. Officials are often afraid to speak up. This means they have failing feedback mechanisms. If the CCP worked on managing and weighing up individual liberties and long-term benefits, they would have consistent, logical things. If it was likely to happen, if they were likely to take this Western vaccine, it would have already happened. The app has an incredibly high burden to prove that the CCP suddenly becomes a rational, logical actor that is able to weigh up the long-term benefits of their citizens and take this Western vaccine. It's not in their interest. If it's not broke, don't fix it, right? If Xi Jinping can market himself effectively at the moment, there is no need to change, because you lose that power, you lose that dominance, you lose that provision narrative that the CCP relies on, Speaker, and that is why we win this debate.
First negative speaker to that speech, and welcome the second affirmative speaker.
Chris started off his speech by telling us, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? But what the data shows us, what the current context in China shows us, is that it in fact is very, very broken, right? Because let's look at Sinovac, let's look at Sinopharm and the kind of vaccines that are being made in China. These vaccines are statistically less likely to prevent transmission, less likely to prevent death, and less likely to make help you not get sick. That's just the facts. That's just the data, right? If that's not enough for you, just look at China right now, right? This in the world where everyone's stepping out of restrictions, where mask mandates are slowly being removed, China still has 45 cities in strict lockdowns. People can't move in and out, vehicles can't move in and out. That's contributing to things like logistics, like prices of logistics going up, global inflation going up. That is the situation today, right? When they tell us things about nationalistic attitudes, about vaccine, about people being and all these like problems that they were telling us, right? We think that in the wake of the kind of harms that are happening in China, in the kind of humanitarian harms that are happening, that these are just not justifiable enough for people to not use mRNA vaccines, which are proven to be a lot more efficient, right? Now, before I move into some substantive, I'm just going to deal with some levels of rebuttal, right? So the first one about how, you know, Xi Jinping isn't the controlling power, is the controlling power, and that we can't really, you know, separate the two. We said that on a first level, the actor in this debate and how we contextualize this debate was as the CCP, as the 95 million people, right? But just dealing with what they told us as well, right? We think that coordination and controlling of these 95 million people is a difficult task, and even if Xi Jinping is like this controlling actor that they're talking about, we still don't think this control will happen, especially given the context that Isaac gave you. The fact that these people are revolting against the lockdowns, revolting against the kind of harms that COVID gives them. We think that this is not going to happen on the first level, right? And on a second level, right? What did they tell us? This vaccine isn't magic. You know, even if you do get these kind of like Western medication, it's not magic. You still have transmission. You still have things like that. We say that on a first level that it's much on both sides of the house. We copped and we considered that there is going to be sickness, there is going to be transmissibility. But the question really was, who does it better? Who gets out of this with less harms? Who gets out of this with less people dying? Who gets out of this with like way less harms? And that's our side. Because we've proven to you that in countries where they've used Western mRNA technology, where they've used technology that just is better, they get out of it with a lot less harms. And the proof of it is by looking at the world today and looking at Western countries doing better because they use vaccines that are more efficient, right? What we don't understand is just by having the label Western, or just because it's developed in the West, we don't understand why side negative has such an affinity towards it, right? Because we think that if you look at the world and if you look on a global scale of how things work, we think that China is in the middle of supply chains, is in the middle of economies, right? We think that there is a massive interdependence, and this is something that they can capitalize on, something the CCP can capitalize on. Like, look at China. They even import things like minerals, they import things like airplanes. Like, literally your life depends on things like this. We think in the same way, this is vaccines. This is like a direct link to helping you live, helping you become healthier, helping you get back to work. And we think that these are the kinds of attitudes that the CCP stands for. That it consists of businessmen who value business, and we think that this is the kind of attitudes that we want to kind of put forward and extend into vaccines and kind of and reduce any hesitancy that might exist, right? And what else did they tell us? You know what? By China finally using Western medicine, what happens is that it destabilizes the economy. It looks really bad because now news articles are going to say, you know what, news articles are going to be like, oh, China has finally started using Western medicine. It looks really bad. We say that we refuse to buy into the narrative that just because it's Western that people are, that it's going to look bad, right? Because let's look at COVID. It's not a fight of, oh, China's doing better. It's not like which country is doing better. It's a global fight, because if China still has COVID, the rest of the world will inevitably still have COVID. if Australia has COVID, then other countries of the world will have COVID, because that's the nature of the world. It's globalized, everyone travels, right? So we think that it's not going to be bad on China, but it's actually going to look good, because now they're using something effective. They're contributing to this global fight, this fight where everyone has to kind of come together to solve this massive problem, which is COVID, right? Now I'm going to be dealing with the rest of my rebuttal in my kind of substantive point, which is why these times are extremely unprecedented, and why China is an extremely important why the CCP is an extremely important actor in this debate, right? So let's look at China, right? When you look at China, the kind of people that are vulnerable in this debate are the aging population, the people who are kind of forced into congested housing, and the people who are forced into these extremely strict lockdowns. What we see in China is that the government has been pushing towards this COVID-0 strategy, and we think that in achieving these kind of like low transmissibility goals, what you need is an effective tool to do this. And what the evidence that points towards this is using mRNA technology, right? The technology which is just absent in the kind of vaccine that China produces. We think that what happens at the end of the day is when China uses technology such as this, is that things get a lot better. We have a lot less people who are sick. And why is this beneficial? This is beneficial because China, as I told you earlier, is in the middle of things like supply chains, in the middle of things like logistics. And what happens then is these things run a lot smoother, because the restrictions that happen in China are things where vehicles can't even move in and out of cities. And that's really problematic, because so many countries rely on China for things like manufacturing, rely on China for things like having their factories and sourcing products and workers from. So what happens now is that we have extremely high global inflation rates, and a massive contributing factor to this is the fact that prices are going up in China because of these horrible restrictions that are keeping people out of work, keeping people locked up in their homes, keeping people unable to even buy things like groceries. And we think that at the end of the day, nothing is worth these kind of restrictions. Nothing is worth the kind of mental anguish that people go through by being locked up in their homes because the vaccine that they are using is not efficient enough. We think that is really stupid, and we think it's really horrible that just because a vaccine and a technology was developed in the West, that it's not being used to help people, right? These nationalistic attitudes that they're talking about is harming the country so much that we think that it's just not worth it. And that's something the CCP kind of has the mandate to do, right? They do crazy things, right? Like in the wake of things like overpopulation, they have things like the one-child policy, right? And we say that in times like this, seeing how unprecedented and how crazy the situation is right now, they have this control and they have the ability to mandate things that some people may not like, that may not fit their nationalistic sentiments, right? Because we think that even if you have to reduce these kind of sentiments, we think that it's okay, and we think that it's actually beneficial, and it's actually beneficial, right? Because they didn't really tell us what are the benefits of having these nationalistic attitudes. We don't know, and it does not weigh up against the kind of harms and the kinds of impacts that COVID has, and the kind of impacts that happen when you get sick and when people die. And for all these reasons, we urge you to affirm.
I'd like to thank the second affirmative.
Structure. I do that too. Did you guys know? I've never noticed you do that. That's a hot take.
The affirmative team lose this debate because the CCP is not a democracy that reflects the interests of the middle class and upper class people who are millions members of it. Otherwise, in this debate, the current strategy that the CCP has been pursuing wouldn't have gone on for so long. Because if they did have the control over the party the way that the affirmative team needs them to, then we wouldn't be looking at China in the way that we currently do in the status quo. They have not proven to you a single reason why the CCP cares about the efficacy of this vaccine. They have only proven to you that they need an exit strategy from the current road that they are walking down in terms of their zero COVID strategy. They have not tied any of these benefits directly to these vaccines coming from mRNA. They have only suggested that efficacy is a debaterism value in this debate, and they have not argued that the CCP itself, rather than the random family old members within it, cares about this. The first thing to say then is on the priorities of the CCP, they give you three. They tell you power, economic growth, and international prestige. They miss the one that we all have known since the first time we did a China debate, which is ideology, right? The CCP is not a democracy. These three priorities they tell you are a sign of their great misunderstanding in this debate of where this party draws its power from. It is not drawing its power from making people happy, and they admit that within their own case when they tell you that it has the power to lie, and they tell you that it has the power to control its people, and they tell you that it has the power to conduct major scale lockdowns in this debate. We tell you that the biggest interest of this party is ideology, and that ideology is something that is constantly weighed up both by the CCP and other governments in the context of COVID-19. That is to say that if you look at the arguments provided by that speaker about efficacy of vaccines, she tells you that, look, because it's more efficacious, you get less sick people, and that is the best thing for your country. But guess what? Even in Australia, a democracy that functions the way that they need the CC to function for them in this debate, we have made decisions, our government has made decisions that have sacrificed the amount of sick people and made it artificially higher than it needed to be in order to protect their ideology, which is that they don't inhibit individual freedoms. If the number one priority of governments was to save the maximum number of lives, the Australian government would be doing more to inhibit all of our freedoms right now. We wouldn't be standing in this room and know that that happens in a world where we are all currently injected with the vaccines that this team is saying is the magic wand will save China in this debate. The opposite incentives apply for the CCP. They sacrifice the number of lives not to stop infringing on people's ideology, but to keep their pure ideology as something that needs to be protected in a world in which it is consistently attacked. That is to say, the communist ideology is a rare one that is unable to be protected by the attacks of the West, something that is developed in its antitheticalness to the Western way of doing things, and something that is worth trading off a small margin of lives in order to protect, because otherwise the CCP in and of itself will cease to exist. So we then tell you that why a rush exit from this strategy is not in the CCP's interests. We tell you that currently they have a lot of justification for their strategy. They have the ability to point to the fact that they have the best economic growth in the G20 since 2018. They also have the ability to point to the lowest mortality rates in these countries, any large country, since 2018. So even if you believe everything these teams tell you, that CCP only draws its power from being able to prove a lack of death, they already have this benefit in the status quo, and they don't need to make concessions to the West in order to have that to control their people. The second thing we tell you, though, is that the CCP has failing feedback mechanisms within the party, meaning it is unlikely to work like a family democracy with the interests of its members as the number one priority. And thirdly, we tell you that Z is currently being pushed forward by the entire party to break a norm that historically has not been broken and be put through for a third term. That shows that the power of Xi Jinping in this debate is unprecedented. He has large support. This is out of the norm. He doesn't have the normal amount of support for a leader of this Communist Party. He has the most support that we have seen in recent memory. That shows that they are more interested in protecting his interests than they are in their own. But also, we would argue that the two are tied together in this debate. Finally, we tell you that a rush AgSet might not actually work in saving lives the way that they tell you, because all of their benefits in this debate are the fact that the Western vaccine has already been developed, so you can get it into arms like in the next couple of months and get people out of lockdown really, really soon. However, that's quite bad, because it means that a lot of people are going to die very, very suddenly in this debate if you exit lockdowns as fast as they want you to. That is to say, it's highly likely, based on the rate of efficacy of mRNA vaccines and also the size of the Chinese population, that around 2 million people will die apply when you stop these lockdowns. It was far better that you did this slowly, because if you do it slowly, you get less net deaths. And therefore, if you're doing it slowly anyway, why do you need to import vaccines from the West when you could just use slightly less efficacious ones? The final thing to say then on this issue is about the loss of control. So we hear from the second speaker two things. One, that currently people are revolting against the lockdown. So that is just a reason to try to slow down the lockdowns, right? That is not a reason to necessarily use Western vaccines to do so. But secondly, we tell you that it's highly likely, in my speech, that these people in China will revolt against being subject to the Western vaccine. That's because the mechanism that Isaac gives you in his speech about platforms like Weibo and WeChat and things that are used to spread propaganda between people outside the eyes of the CCP are the heaviest criticizers of the West and Western vaccines in this debate, more so than the CCP itself. That is to say, a lot of people that live even in Australia but are part of Chinese communities are afraid to get vaccinated because of what they have read on these platforms about the mRNA technology. They are highly unlikely to think favorably of it. This team has not proven that they will see it as a pure import, and also it is not a nationalistic product in the interest of the CCP of having that put into their arms. At the end of this issue, even if they prove to you that China needs to start vaccinating people, we would argue that that's not necessarily the best strategy for the CCP itself in this debate, maybe if it was democracy. But secondly, if they do need to vaccinate people, they can do it without Western vaccines, which leads me to the idea of which vaccine is more feasible and efficacious. So in terms of what we tell you about them and being able to develop their own vaccine, note that this is just margin stacking in this debate, because they don't even need to develop a new one. All we have to do is defend the existing ones, because that is all they have attacked. They have not dealt with the reality of this debate, that China could develop new vaccines in the timeline over 2 years or even 1 year, noting specifically that the mRNA vaccines they support on their side came about extremely quickly in the West and didn't take that long to develop. But we also told you, in response to what they say about the lack of biotech industry, that we get all of the onus for vaccine development they told you that they lack, right? They said, well, the reason in China that there's no good vaccines is because there's no onus. Why don't we just, as the CCP, take all of the onus that they have to sacrifice their ideology and buy Western vaccines, and instead invest that into producing and boosting production of our own? It seems far more logical, it seems cheaper, and it seems like it will reach you faster. Then we also tell you that this vaccine is going to be slightly less efficacious if it doesn't get developed, say it just stays where it is. But that's not a huge harm, because A, you can circumvent this by giving additional boosters, B, you can circumvent this by having more public health measures like masks, and C, the difference in efficacy isn't as huge as they tell you in this debate. Maybe it's like an additional 500,000 lives lost. That is something that's not going to cost you as much as a loss of your ideology as the CCP in this debate. And then finally, on the idea of the economy, they tell you that, you know, the global economy is going to be upset by China not being able to support its supply chains, but that's when they argue against themselves, because in Australia we struggle far more to protect our supply chains, to have groceries on the shelves in a world where we do have these Western vaccines and we have stopped having lockdowns. Lockdown strategy is actually better for controlling supply chains, because Omicron still infects people even if they are vaccinated. They can't go to work, they can't get those foods on the shelves, they can't get the benefit that they tried to claim there in this debate. At the end of this, it's in the CCP's interest to go through its own plan, to get Z into his third term, and to stick with something that doesn't require them to go back on their entire history of ideology.
I'd like to thank the second negative speaker for that speech, and welcome the third negative speaker.
Before Brendan gives a speech, might I just quickly wrap?
Sorry, everyone. One moment. I did.
Cool. All good on the Zoom? Great. Everyone will speak? Cool. 3, 2, oh, sorry. 3, 2, 1. The observation I would make about the negative case is that, listen to it, it's all about this idea of loss of control. There's a fear in the negative case, as the Chinese Communist Party, that if we use Western mRNA vaccines, we will admit it, we have lost control. We will admit it, that our ideology is not as potent as we believe it to be. We'll lose stability, that'll harm us in the upcoming National Congress and the way in which people look at us there. And our claim and our response is very simple. If you are afraid of losing control. Your biggest fear should be the chaos in Shanghai. Your biggest fear should be food rations which are incompetently delivered. Your biggest fear should be cops running through the streets, separating children from parents, people fighting back. That is the chaos. That is the loss of control. The problem with the pandemic is that you don't get to decide exactly when or how, or you don't get to decide whether you lose control or not. You just get to decide the circumstances under which you lose control, right? It's coming under both sides. Omicron is real, its particles move through the air, like China cannot stop that from occurring, and at that point, we need to make every step necessary to minimize the amount of chaos it is going to cause. And that is really the problem with the negative case. Because the premise of that case is, well, we'll suck up a lot of death because it'll help us preserve our image, we'll look strong. But what makes us look weak is Shanghai. What makes us look incompetent is people struggling, is the entire Southeast being forced into lockdown as the major population centers there have serious Omicron outbreaks, and the logic of zero COVID forces us to shut down entire cities. And then the people in those cities push back, and then we can't get food to them properly, and then there are food riots. That is the harm that makes the CCP look bad. If you are worried about the National Congress, you should be worried about that harm. Three things in this speech. Firstly, I'll just discuss this question of exactly who the CCP is quite briefly. Secondly, I'll talk about zero COVID and China's vaccines and whether they would work and why that harm, as we claim, is locked in. Finally, I'll talk about the reputational risk here. Firstly, on the question of leadership, we would point out the name of the actor in this debate is not Xi Jinping, it's the Chinese Communist Party. We feel we've given you a reasonable definition of what that looks like. We think we have a certain amount of fiat enough to do so. But the second thing we would note is even though ideological control is a priority of the CCP, as we explained, not all priorities are weighted equally, and as I've just explained, loss of Chinese ideology, the ideology of the CCP is like we are great at running the country, continue to let us do so. If we massively and publicly fuck up running the country, that is a loss of an ideological narrative. The third thing we say is, the National Congress, they kind of use that to try and leverage it to explain why we should care most about control. I've already explained why you would want Shanghai and things like it to become less likely to be solved, right, or claim that you're winning the battle against COVID at the point the National Congress exists. They then point out that, China hasn't done it already, which means that, therefore they shouldn't do it. We explain that this is an actor debate. As the actor, we say they should. We say we've miscalculated. We've made the same error the Australian government made in the early parts of 2021. The Australian society more generally, right? Everyone thought we've gotten over the worst of COVID, we'll vaccinate sometime, it'll kind of happen. We didn't vaccinate fast enough. New strains came out and we had to lock down again and everyone fucking hated it. And that's the problem we're trying to avoid here, right? The final thing they say, and the final thing to observe, right? Even if you don't believe we're literally talking about 95 million people and you want to constrain that set of people to a couple of thousand party elites, they still live in China. They still care about China. They'll get up in the morning and go, I am trying to do this because I believe in the Chinese people, the Chinese vision, a powerful country, returning after and rising again after a century of humiliation. You have Chinese relatives, you are Chinese, you do not want them to die, you probably care about trying to fight the pandemic. Unclear why, they are literally so, soulless, power optimizing robots, they would be willing to incur massive, massive pandemic harms. Let's then deal. Is the current strategy going to work? Because that is the next claim they make. They say, changing it would be a really large change, a lot of risks. One, this is uncomparative for the reasons I've already explained. The big risks are coming, right? But two, they rebut an argument we do not make. Which is to say, we don't have to give everyone an mRNA vaccine, open up the economy immediately, wrap ourselves in the Star-Spangled Banner, and then shoot ourselves. We could, for example, right? Instead, give everyone an mRNA vaccine, open it slowly, tell them it's a Chinese vaccine, do a variety of things such that we don't have to open the economy immediately and then incur the harm that they thought they could claim, which was millions of deaths because we have to do this quickly. We have to be fast in vaccinating people, but we can still maintain lockdowns for a while. But we can tell people the vaccines are coming, the new vaccines that we've just invented are coming. That would probably mollify people. It's not the case that they get to claim that harm. The next thing they say is, China doesn't have enough natural immunity, therefore there's COVID's going to kill a lot of people. Anyway, this is a truly criminal attempt at mitigation, right? The example they give is the UK, that most of the people who got sick in the UK were unvaccinated, which is what will happen when Omicron moves through the air, infects old people who are unvaccinated and kills them, right? Vaccines work at stopping this, and they work at a really large, it's not a tiny advantage. The reason why they're so important is because they radically reduce mortality risk. They radically reduce transmissibility risk. They then claim in the dying moments of Leah's speech, zero COVID's okay because supply chains work better when you have a lockdown, which is insane to me. But I think the better response here is look, the reason why we still have supply chain issues now is because of the massive lockdowns that occurred in the first part of the pandemic. Imagine if China has to lock down again right? And more because it's more infectious than more parts of the country that are affected. The supply chain disruption to China and to its trading partners would be immense, which is of course exactly why the West were willing to, so eager to give us those vaccines. Finally, on Chinese vaccines. They say, well, those Chinese vaccines might have advantages to the US. Fine, if they're useful, we can use them too where necessary. We think mRNAs, though, are broadly far more better. They say, well, we can do mRNA tech too. No, you can't. The reason you can't, and if they could, they would have already used it on Sinovac, and Sinovac would actually work properly, but it doesn't. And the reason is because mRNA vaccine is incredibly advanced biotech. We give this analysis at first half. It's quite advanced biotechnology, and only a handful of Western companies have access to it. Like, China is still a developing country, does not have access to their technology. Unfortunately, they just don't have mRNA tech. That's why they don't have it, right? That's why they need the West. We wouldn't be doing this topic if that were not the case. Finally, they say, oh, well, look, mRNA isn't that big of a difference in terms of its value. Yes, it is. It's massively more valuable. That is why China is facing this enormous problem of largely unvaccinated or poorly vaccinated elderly people. They say you can use masks. Like, masks improve your risks by about 20%. There's a reason we don't all just wear masks, never got the vaccine. Vaccine works, and there's a reason we're not all wearing masks now. And that's because vaccines, mRNA vaccines, broadly are the most efficient thing that we have here. So let's now talk about, clearly that zero COVID strategy fails. All of those harms lock in, all of the harms that we occur lock in, all of the loss of control occurs under their own metrics, or lose the debate. But let's extend the margin. Let's talk about the popularity and legitimacy of the party within China. They say we've spent 2 years bad-mouthing Western vaccines. As we've already explained, the best predictor for a drop in vaccine hesitancy is aggressive and punitive lockdowns. Ordinary Chinese people are unlikely to care about exactly where they think the vaccine might have come from if the alternative is not being able to go to work. We would know there are other very strong social narratives in China, like the social narrative to earn a lot of money, like rise up because it's a developing country and everyone's really obsessed with that. Lockdowns prevent people from being able to access that, right? Which is of course why people will be able to kind of make peace with themselves of getting this particular vaccine. Also, we can just lie and tell them it was Chinese. That was never responded to. Finally, we can say if it is true the CCP has such a level of ideological control over its population, we can just manipulate them into thinking this is a win from China. We can be like, we've stolen mRNA vaccines from the West. We've gotten a great deal. We've leveraged it away from them. And people will be like, wow, what a win for China. I guess I'll take this Western mRNA vaccine because we've stolen their best technology. I don't know. If it is true, we have that much ideological control of the population, we can do that. They say, oh, we can point to the fact we've had a good record because our mortality rates are low. Not going to be low for very long. But also, you can point to graphs all you want. If the entire population is locked down, people will stay mad. Finally, on the question of international reputation, which everyone agrees is the least important thing in the debate, they say, well, China, headlines will read China is caved. That is obviously preferable to headlines that read China's economy in free fall, millions dead. But the final thing they say is, oh, we'll harm our ability to do vaccine diplomacy. But the countries we've given vaccines to are mad because our vaccines don't really work. This would of course help the relationships with them because we can now publicly admit that. Incredibly proud to report this.
Okay, everyone ready? If you want to believe the claim that Brendan makes at the start of his speech, that loss of control is inevitable on both sides, then I ask you all, which creates a greater loss of control? Continuing the current situation, when we can continue locking down and make efforts, as we tell you on our side, to improve Chinese vaccines and ease off this policy generally, or to take a Western vaccine when a country like China, which since its inception in 1949 has been historically anti-Western, which has for 70 years pushed a narrative that is incredibly anti-West, that rejects any Western dependency and forces itself that it must be better than them. Which is worse for a populace that is angry? When you give them more time in a situation that they're already in, but vaccinate them away to get out of it anyway, or accept a huge ideological hypocrisy that literally shakes the foundations on which the Chinese nation is based. If you wanted to argue this debate as an active debate, which we did, on the interest of the CCP, then fundamentally, even if you want to believe the worst possible harms they push in their case, you should still go on our side, because the sheer importance of that ideological struggle and the importance of it being anti-Western in your ideology, that far outweighs anything they could possibly give you on their side. 3 issues in the speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the interests of the CCP. I'm then going to talk about whether Western vaccines actually better their COVID situation, or whether it's our Chinese vaccines and like what our like counterfactual, I guess. And then finally, very briefly, I'll talk about the global and political impacts and how that kind of impacts and like extends our margin of victory. Onto this first idea of the interests of the CCP. And we heard two competing clashes here of what these interests look like. The first thing was to say their idea was like, oh, it's all these 95 million members of the CCP. And the second is what we tell you, which is mainly Xi Jinping. Note firstly, as we kind of told you, China has a history of authoritarianism, right? It is a nation that is fundamentally designed as a dictatorship. This is what has always been the case. Historically, it's been the case. There's no real mechanism on their side as to how there are actually reasons as to how all these other people within this party have a say that is particularly significant, particularly when we give you several mechanisms at first and second on our side as to how there are broken feedback mechanisms in the Chinese Communist Party because of the fear that the state is like puts down on everybody through the police, through the things of like internal policing, things that are also historical norms, as you see for things like Cultural Revolution. We think therefore because of this, it was highly unlikely that these people actually had much of a say. Even if you wanted to agree with their characterization that they disagreed with the current like Chinese COVID policy, they were probably very unlikely to like say this unless they were in a really high position of power. And in that case, they were really unlikely to have these opinions anyway, because they were probably benefited from this far, far more. What else did they tell you? They told you that they failed to like encourage like a good vaccine as well, uptake as well. This must be fixed. If you tell them that like they failed to like in their interest they didn't encourage an uptake because they thought their initial policy was so good, you also have to deal with on your side the fact that vaccine uptake is something you have to prove and something that's incredibly difficult to prove. Given what I've told you in my introduction, as what I'll continue to tell you in this speech, vaccine uptake is probably far more likely on our side with Chinese vaccines if you push that, particularly if you make those Chinese vaccines better. It's probably really, really unlikely that these Western vaccines are going to be uptaken to the extent they want. No, the entirety of the opposition team's case is actually contingent on the fact that these Western vaccines are uptaken. They completely ignored all of Leah's characterization and mechanism in her second speech of why so many people in China wouldn't take these Western vaccines in the first place. That alone should probably lose them this debate, right? What else? We heard a response that's second negative to our characterization when we told you that all of these interests were underpinned by an ideology, and that the nature of that ideology meant that every choice you make, every consequence you weigh, is always going to be interested in upholding not Soviet, CCP ideology, Sino-communism, right? They told you that it's really difficult to control all these 95 million people in the CCP because people are revolting. Ideology is not strong enough to hold them all. These people are literally indoctrinated from birth to believe Chinese ideology, right? This is something that is pushed on you in school. We have things like Mao Zedong thought, like Xi Jinping thought. These are things that are pushed down, right? They told you these national attitudes harm the Chinese people. These national attitudes have always harmed the Chinese people. Look at Great Leap Forward. Look at Cultural Revolution. Look at Tiananmen Square. Nationalism has always hurt the Chinese people. It didn't matter whether it hurt the Chinese people because at the end of the day, it was a narrative of control that the CCP wanted to push. They told you control was something that we couldn't have on our side. We told you that probably didn't matter. Even if that control was an illusion, it was something the CCP would grasp for, and it was probably in its own interest to do so, particularly when you weighed it on the counterfactual. So what we told you that because of the nature of China having to appear powerful to show its strength, because of the fact that it's utilitarian and was always going to weigh the longevity of the regime compared to any possible practical impact on the people of China, it was far more likely that our characterization was the only characterization that actually was able to stand in this debate. Contrary to what Brendan tried to tell you about Western vaccines as a symbol of lost control. Okay, now we get onto the practical of this debate. Which was better for China? Western vaccines or what we propose in the counterfactual. They tell you that Chinese existing vaccines are poor for a few reasons. One, because of the still developing biotech, and told you that it was second priority. First of all, this concession comes from Isaac's speech at first that vaccines are a second priority. If we take this and it was further substantiated in their case, then clearly when on our side we say it's in our interest to make it a first priority, something we have the political capital to be able to do, then obviously Chinese vaccines get so much better on our side, right? So a lot of their material about why Chinese vaccines suck doesn't stand. Furthermore, we gave you really good substantive pushes at second about why this was actually likely to get better. We told you there was a really nationalist benefit in order to actually make these things better. We told you, no, we actually do have the medical biotech capacity to do this. No, China has things like CRISPR, right? They were some of the first nations to do gene editing. That's a pretty advanced level technology. We thought it was pretty fair they'd be able to co-opt mRNA. The reason that they didn't is because of something that they told you on their own side when there wasn't really an interest in China to invest in vaccines that hard in the first place because of the fact lockdowns worked. So clearly lockdowns aren't working now. Obviously mRNA vaccines are something we can get. They are Chinese made. That also then means we don't have to deal with any of the the harms on their side about Western vaccines. What else did they tell you under this? They told you that our biggest fear should be like protests about fear in Shanghai. One, we can undo this fear very simply for a national vaccine program that actually works, when we actually do the kinds of things that aren't happening on their side. Now, both sides want to push in this debate, but we can obviously push it better because we're pushing like Chinese vaccines. And frankly, even if those vaccines are worse, probably doesn't matter. Note as well the comparative here, right? Yes, Chinese vaccines might be worse. That is our worst case. We argue and give you pretty convincing reasons to why that doesn't have to be the case. But even then, the difference between a vaccine that is like 50% effective and like 70% effective is not actually that big of a tangible difference of an equal amount of population that's vaccinated, and it's certainly one that China would be willing to take given all the harms of like conceding like this Western control. Furthermore, on this idea of like protests, right? As I told you into my reduction, right? One, okay, we said both sides are able to ease off these protests gradually through like implementing vaccines, right? However, when we tell you all this characterization through like how platforms on like Weibo, etc., that they want to push as a way of spreading protests, these are also incredibly anti-Western. There is very little pro-Western sentiment in countries like China. It is obviously a massive concession of CCP's power in a way that is really damaging and possibly permanent when you start taking these Western vaccines. We thought that it was highly, highly unlikely that it was actually going to like mean that these protests would stop on their side. We thought if anything it was probably more likely to continue, because then they have literally, the CCP has literally outed the hypocrisy that they have preached, right? It becomes impossible to save yourself then when a regime tells you that they're so anti-Western and then relies on that. The only push we got, like the contrary of this, was Brennan's idea about how like for some reason like they can just steal the Western vaccines and market as that. That kind of missed the point, right? Because it's an ideological reason as to why you wouldn't take a Western vaccine. So even if you lied to your people about it, that didn't matter in this debate, because the fact you were using Western vaccines in the first place was enough of a concession that the CCP hierarchy itself, the CCP party of that 95 million people, that's probably what's then thrown into chaos, right? That was probably a far worse situation, right? So what do we see at the end of this issue? We told you we could definitely get the mRNA vaccines. We tried to tell you when. We told you that we could probably ease protests better on our side. Even if we couldn't, it probably gets worse on their side because of the West like stuff. But even if protest was something that was always going to be temporary in this debate, a protest can eventually end. It is eventually quelled. There have been protests in China before, like Tiananmen Square. Those were crushed. They did not impact the longevity of the regime. What would impact the longevity of the regime is something like admitting that the West is better. Admitting the narrative you have tried to push for 70 years, like domestically and globally, that China is a superior nation, and admitting that that is a failure. That was something that was far greater than any other interest in this debate. It was by far the most important interest. When it was telling you, then like when you consider like the global political impacts, right? It was like Western will obviously give China the vaccines. Yeah, they give West will give China these vaccines, obviously, because that is a concession. The West see that as a win. China's long-term political interests, Belt and Road, etc., those will never come to fruition under the affirmative side. CCP will never get those interests maintained because of the fact China admits it is weak and therefore it cannot fulfill its interests. Thus, as the CCP, we can never support these Western vaccines.